A couple weeks ago, I decided to finally make the jump and switch to Linux. I was tired of all the BS surrounding Windows that I had to deal with, and I was also really excited to experience something I hadn't tried before. Trying new things is something I always typically enjoy, as I consider myself a fairly open-minded person, especially when it comes to tech stuff like this. It's been about 3 weeks since I made the switch, and I wanted to make an update video on how it's been going. Firstly, I want to talk about the immediate pros. Linux has a lot of advantages over Windows, and I'm already beginning to appreciate the differences between the two operating systems. First of all, Linux runs so much lighter than Windows. On Windows, my system would idle at around 2.5 gigabytes of RAM, with the bare minimum stuff open in the background. On my desktop running Pop! OS with a GNOME desktop environment, also with minimal background apps open, the system idles at around 1.5 gigs of RAM. Going even further, my laptop running Manjaro Linux with the XFCE desktop environment idles at around 660 megabytes of RAM, which is just over half a gigabyte. Mind you, this is comparing the stock Windows experience with the Riced Linux experience. So even with pretty themes and extra desktop applications or extensions running, Linux still takes the cake for performance by a wide margin. Speaking of the customization, this is another one of the obvious pros. On Windows, you can customize things a little bit, but not to the extent you can on Windows. I can change everything down to the kernel itself if I want to on Linux, which is something that I really appreciate as an enthusiast. I haven't gone that deep down the rabbit hole yet, but I have riced my desktop environment with custom community-created themes, extensions, and applications. Pop! OS ships by default with the GNOME desktop environment, which on its own I don't much care for, but with a couple extensions like Dash to Dock, which adds an application dock, Arc Menu, which adds something similar to the classic Windows 7 Start menu, and a custom user theme, things start to get pretty cozy. Another thing I really love so far is the terminal. Yeah, it does sound kind of tedious to do stuff by typing in commands, and this can be true for a few things, but it does definitely have its uses. If I want to edit a system file for whatever reason, instead of opening the file manager, navigating to where the file is, and then opening it, I can just type one command and do the exact same thing. It's really great for installing programs too. Instead of going down to the program's website, finding the right installer, downloading it, running it, I can type one command and install the package I want. It's something that takes a bit of getting used to, but you end up appreciating it in the end. And if you don't want to take the time to learn the terminal, you can do pretty much everything you can in the terminal in a normal GUI, so it's not a big deal if you can't be bothered with it. So, now that all the great stuff is out of the way, it's time to talk about the issues I've had so far. I'm going to go through these one by one and rank each of them 1 through 5, 5 being the most difficult to deal with. Thankfully, most of these were really minor things fixed by a Google search and some quick work, but they're still worth mentioning. Firstly, I had an issue where occasionally the desktop would freeze, go black for a second, and come back a few seconds later. I have no idea what was causing this, but it looked to me like a case of bad video drivers. So I installed the latest drivers from NVIDIA and it fixed the issue. Updating video drivers is actually easier on Linux than on Windows, only taking one click. 1 out of 5. Secondly, I had an issue with screen tearing in games and videos. This was happening anytime there was a quick motion on screen, and it really annoyed the crap out of me. So I looked up how to fix it, and it was as simple as changing one setting in the NVIDIA control panel. 1 out of 5. The last issue I had was with Team Fortress 2. I already talked about it in my VAC video, so I'm not going to go into too much detail, but basically I was having bad performance issues and I needed to do some modding and tweaking to fix it. It took me a while to find a fix online that worked, and it frustrated me that a native Linux game ran so poorly out of the box. I was able to get it running at almost, but not quite, Windows performance levels, but it did take some elbow grease. 3 out of 5. Now, another thing I want to talk about is programs and games. As you probably know, many beloved and widely used apps either refuse to run on Linux without the help of tools like Wine or Proton, and others refuse to run at all. So far, I haven't had any issues with this. All my native Linux games run perfectly with the exception of TF2, and the Windows games I've tested with Proton have worked fine. SCP Secret Lab runs fine despite being an unstable game even on Windows, and Sea of Thieves runs fine as long as VSync is enabled in-game. For the applications I can't run on Linux, I found alternatives. For recording and getting clips, I've switched to OBS from Shadowplay. For schoolwork, I've started using the online version of Microsoft Office instead of normal Office apps. Yes, I know LibreOffice does exist. I actually used it for a while and liked it a lot, but my school pays for my Office subscription and I enjoy that better, so I might as well take advantage. Now, all these things considered, was the switch worth it? I would say, yes, definitely. Switching to Linux has been great so far. I've had less issues in day-to-day use than I had with Windows, and the issues I do come across are simple fixes that usually just take a few minutes to deal with. If you're thinking of switching to Linux or on the fence about it, definitely give it a chance. You can always switch back if you don't enjoy it, but I think you'll be pleasantly surprised if you decide to stick with it for a while.